At first glance, it looks like the Expedia website is already applying the sticky call to action pattern. If we look at the hotel pages, what's floating are the top navigation. There's a select a room button that's also highly visible. It's basically nudging users to kind of that next step along some sort of path of action. It's a popular pattern, but a single pattern can be done in almost infinite ways. Things can be stretched, things could be like intensified, new variables could be added to the pattern. So I think it has more upside. Hey, I'm Jacob Lanowski, and I wanted to share with you 3 tests I designed for Expedia with 2 goals in mind. One being, I hope this inspires actually the Expedia team to attempt some replications of this pattern. There's an ongoing project with Kohavi and Lukas Vermeer and myself where we're trying to inspire different companies to attempt replications of probable successful patterns and see where things may go. And the second goal, hopefully by sharing some of these kind of tests, I can inspire other people to maybe design better experiments. Jumping into one of the first experiments here on the listing page, I can very briefly kind of give you a bit of a rundown of how I organize typical experiments. On the left-hand side here, I typically bring anything that kind of inspires the experiment. Here is also ideas as they're being explored, and not all explored ideas actually make it into the experiment on the right. So this is kind of like a bit of a playground for stretching the design space a little bit more. Obviously here in the top right is the actual test design itself. So these are different parameters that may be considered for organizing this experiment. Things like typical metrics, custom metrics, how the experiment is triggered, who's in the experiment, who's not in the experiment, at which point they enter the experiment. Certain segments which may be interesting to later on analyze and look at. Start-stop times, whether there's different traffic allocation, how it's randomized by, and stop rules, and occasionally also estimates, for which also can drive sample size and the duration of an experiment. So looking at the core essence of this experiment here, it basically has a desktop control here. Anything A is the status quo, it's the control version. Anything B, C, D, and so forth is the actual variants. And I've only done this here for the mobile version. This could be also done and applied for desktop, but let's have a look at some of the kind of ideas that this started emerging here. So first one is, I can see that there is nothing floating on the listing page, right? So as users are scrolling through these sections, the first hypothesis here is, what if filters was floating? What if that became more visible at all times? And hopefully that would drive more relevancy whenever the time arose that people wanted to refine something. Okay, the trigger here is set, so the experiment would be triggered at this point here. So there is nothing floating. Or sorry, let me put it this way. There's like some filters and some map references already being shown up front in the very initial state. So only as users would scroll further down, maybe that's kind of when the experiment would start, and that's also when the element would float. All right, B variation, visible filter. C version, very similar, essentially just playing with a lighter tone, maybe less obtrusive, maybe what could be compared and across these 2 experiments is the intensity, right? So this is a lot more visible, would potentially receive more progression, more clicks. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Hopefully by comparing these 2 variants, that could be determined. Next version tries to show the check-in and checkout dates along with filters. And Further down are ideas, are separate test ideas with different triggers. Okay, so if there are users that have not expressed dates, so people who use the default, so that this August 16, 17 is a default. Could this experiment run for such people, and at that point encourage a more appropriate, hopefully, date to be added? So that's kind of this secondary listing page experiment. And again, being done in two ways, maybe more visible, but also less obtrusive, less overlap on the actual listing pages, and maybe something that kind of overlaps the page. All right. The next experiment is the hotel page, and here we have the control versions for desktop. Here is the default version, the onload. But as users are scrolling, we can see that this element starts floating. And all these variations here are challenging that. And the first idea here is to potentially tie this button label into the recommended room. So here on the listing page, on the hotel page, there's a bit of a subtle recommendation, right, with the kind of first primary result. And what if this, instead of select a room, maybe view recommended room, just to play on that, hey, Expedia recommends this room. Side benefit of this is that maybe this becomes a larger button, which historically has shown to increase progression. Obviously, that's a micro metric, doesn't always materialize into something more meaningful like bookings, but perhaps worth a try. C variant challenges where to drive people to. So instead of just selecting a room, provides alternative paths around check-in dates. Assumption here, or hypothesis, might be that, hey, if people kind of express these dates better, maybe they'll have more relevant results, or maybe they forgot to express these. Maybe these are just defaults, right? Third variation D evolves that kind of select a room and surfaces the filters for a number of beds. And we can see some filtering happening here. So it's basically taking these and making them essentially float, right? All with the interest of increasing relevancy and encouraging, adjusting the results there. Two more kind of test ideas with slightly different triggers. So it's important to have the same trigger be on the control and the variant. And the trigger for this subtest may be hotels which have no rooms for given dates. So occasionally there are situations where, hey, we have no rooms available, right? Specifically with some default August 16, one day overnight thing, right? So challenger to that test may be, hey, there are no rooms available, try new dates. Obviously, I'd probably work more on this copy, but the primary call to action becomes adjust your check-in dates, checkout dates. Last but not least, this is the checkout test idea. And currently nothing is being floated, or there's no sticky call to action on checkout. And one situation that comes up here that may be worth exploring is something along the lines of only run this experiment for people who have done three things: who have scrolled all the way to the bottom and then they scroll up, but also who have filled out all these fields. So a potential situation where someone's completing all this, here they go to the bottom and then maybe they want to check something, right? And at that point, the experiment starts and begins to float different options. And the three variations for this are the following: with completing a booking floating at this point, this will be the same as pressing this button here, so making that transaction happen. On second thought, there is a little bit of a concern that this may increase accidental purchases with accidental thumb clicks. So probably worth measuring returns and cancellations and upset customers in some degree later on. Thinking through this a little bit further, what if there was a bit of a soft return to kind of the bottom of the page, something along the lines of continue booking, that basically gets users to this screen here. And third, what if an additional price total was appended here? Would that help customers kind of feel more comfortable and finish that kind of booking with the same interaction of just scrolling downwards? So yeah, hopefully this encourages some test design, and hopefully it also shows kind of how I structure experiments, and maybe will inspire you to do the same. Cool. Cheers.